This show is one of 3 solo exhibitions I've had in the last 2 years, focusing on my new work that I started at the McDowell Colony in 2012. This show in particular follows the show at Lehigh University, Tracing Time to Measure Space, because I took the images from that and took slices of them and introduced them to the printmaking process. I was awarded the Artist in Residency at the Experimental Printmaking Institute for the academic year 2013-2014, and it allowed me to really see how my work could be translated through mediums. So, if we start here, this drawing is endemic of, you might say, part of my work process and how this show started to develop. It's a combination of a construction, which was a laser cut piece of the architect, which I'll talk about later, and it's mounted on a drawing from 1994 or 93 when I initially did the architect. And when I did this model, I used my airbrush to spray through it. So it's kind of, I call it a constructing drawing because it's really constructing in my mind several different ideas that come with the idea of layering, which is an important part of my work. This intro panel I did specifically for this show because I wanted to not just show the products of my work, but I wanted to show some of the process and what I went through while I was the artist in residence. And so I'm displaying a few plates that I can use when we walk around and I describe the show to students and visitors. But then I just show 3 pieces here that kind of demonstrate a process where when I initially learned how to do calligraphy, not calligraphy, I'm sorry, etching, I etched the plate and then we printed several of these line drawings. And that plate's very smooth. It's very similar to this, where the line actually is barely scratched into the surface. After I finished doing a run of about 10 of these, I painted out the plate. This is the plate for that. Aerial, I think it's called aerial formations. And I painted it out and put it in the acid for 25 hours. And it ended up burning out a lot of the background and raising the line, so it had started to have a relief. And that was interesting discovery for me because when I was inking it, and I roll, you ink and you roll, you put the ink on and you roll it and you rub it into the color, into the etching. But on this one, when I rolled, I let the roller hit where it could hit and where it didn't hurt. So you'll see on this, the background's fairly light and there's a little bit of a dark line at the edge of the plate that actually creates a little bit of a shadow, which was a nice little discovery. And this whole show is kind of a series of discoveries that I make while I'm learning the process. And as I've always told my students, sometimes mistakes are gifts or hidden intentions. And so they tended to produce a lot of work that wasn't deterministic in my mind. It was more of how the thing evolves. And even on this final plate, after I had the plate inked in blue and ran a print and took most of the ink off, I then ran red ink over it. So again, the red ink will hit some areas depending on the pressure of my hand. And then I accidentally wiped some of the red off the high edge, and that was really a nice discovery. So again, this is the process of maybe 4 plates. I have 3 here. But I can see in all of my pieces here, I'm going to continue to print them. Each time I print them slightly different. Let's step over here and let me talk to you about this kind of group of work, because this group of work follows one particular theme. And in 1993, I think a year after I came to Lehigh, Ricardo Vieira gave me a show where I did a series of these shadow models and shadow drawings. And it was shortly after I started this whole process to use as an artist as well as an academic, because when I was at Georgia Tech, I started this process of shadow casting for my students and for myself to generate architectural form. So this drawing here it's ink on paper, and I call it the architect because it was the first formal model I made to kind of codify the process of shadow banking. So this model here, while I was building it horizontal on a table, every 15 minutes I would trace the shadow, and I did that sometime in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, sometimes over several days, but always at those 3 times of the day. And in this particular piece, the grid-like form comes from a series of drawings I did at Georgia Tech that was trying to explain more the theory behind the shadow and the rationality of the grid and all the things we use in architecture. So I only allowed myself to make one diagonal, and that's the diagonal there, the perpendicular to it comes with it. But as I was making it, like I said, I drew this, and one of the reasons why I didn't want to put more diagonals in is because I knew the shadows would always be at a diagonal. So, and usually when I do this shadow casting process, I dismantle the model. Because when I dismantle a model, there's only the memory of it through its shadow. So this is a primitive. I call this a primitive. So in this particular section of the gallery, I took this notion of the primitive. And first I made an embossing. So what I did is I had this drawing put into the computer so that we could laser cut it. And then I used the laser cut pieces to create an embossing. And again, here was another example of a happy accident. When the laser cutter cuts the chipboard, it leaves a dust on it. And so when you make an embossing, you put your chipboard down, and then you wet the paper, and you put it on the form. And when I pulled it off, I noticed there was the dust of the chipboard on it. That was really quite a nice discovery, because when I first came and talked to Curly Holton about doing printmaking, I remember asking him, I would really like to capture the smear that comes in my drawings when I do pencil on mylar, and as I'm drawing, my hand smearing the lead. And then I can go back and erase. And he wisely said, well, you should look for the smear in printmaking. And this was, again, another first example of the smear, something that comes as a byproduct of the process, not as an intention of the artist. So those things are always wonderful for me. And embossings are quite beautiful because they deal with this notion of casting. And I see all my printmaking as casting rather than drawing. So all the things that I've cast are the reverse of the drawing. So you can see this casting is the reverse of the drawing, as well as the collagraphs. But then when you look at the airbrushes, which we'll look at in a second, they're a drawing, and so they actually capture the image as it is. So there was, the whole idea that these are based on shadow casting, and now I'm actually casting into a material. It all seemed to work with my brain, and that's why I call these shadow cast impressions or prints of darkness. When I did this, it kind of generated a series of pieces. So I ended up discovering something new. I bought an airbrush, which I've always wanted to have, and I then used the templates that I used for the collagraphs to actually do some airbrushing. So I used the templates to mask where I wanted to airbrush. And this is a fairly thick mylar. It's got a drawing surface on both sides. And the first one I did was this one here, and it was really a wonderful event because I went into the studio, I had everything set up. I was actually not very excited about airbrushing because I had tried the more traditional method of masking everything out, and it was too tedious and I didn't want to go there. So therefore I gave up control and started to play. So I just started to play with the airbrush, and within an hour or so this thing came out, and I was amazed. And, I'm always telling my students to be prepared for amazement, and I was amazed. So I actually went home after I did this because I didn't want to screw it up. Yeah, I wanted to, relish the moment. And actually, it was on my birthday, so it was an interesting gift. And so I did a series of these. There's probably 10 or so airbrushes, About 5 or so are on the architect, and the others are on the piece that I used to make the plexiglass cube at Lehigh's show. It's called Playform. And those are the first 2 images that I used back in the early 90s to generate this whole idea. So they kind of stay with me, and I was kind of intrigued with the idea of doing a section where a person can see the evolution of the drawing through several different printing techniques. Because I consider this printing because I'm using the laser cut element and airbrushing. As well as you can see here, when you finally take those laser cut pieces and translate it into wood, you get, I did a piece at the show at Lehigh as well called Shadow Box that was done with layers of wood in a enclosed box, so you only were able to look at it from one direction. When I did this, I got the pieces back and the laser cutter didn't cut all the way through. Again, another happy accident, because then it almost became a laser cut drawing. And I really enjoyed it. And some of the pieces popped out, so the fact that it wasn't what I intended opened up my mind again, and as I was working on one side, I actually thought about working on 2 sides at the same time. So when I turn this, you'll see that the back is a laser cut that really I had them. I said, burn as much as you can. I want to go through, and it literally did burn the edges. So I started to work on this as a facade, you might say, because in architecture we create facades, and one side usually relates to the public and the other side relates to the private. So this piece was kind of a nice evolution that allowed me to take, every time I'm drawing, I'm making models, like I mentioned with the first piece. So for me, you don't do a drawing and then make a model. You actually do a drawing and a model at the same time, and they kind of inform each other. So I'm going to continue to pursue this direction, and if I find an angel that gives me lots of money, I would love to see these things full scale, where maybe a person's about this big and maybe made out of cortan steel. So all of my constructions are things that I do that I hope in the future I can make at a larger scale in a public zone. Okay, let me take you over here and show you, because what I tried to do in this area is to show a particular process on one image. And then when you follow the back wall, these are all examples of the different techniques that I tried. So you saw the embossing of the architect. Now this is an embossing I did of pieces. And the original piece is really only that size. But I had some other pieces and floated them on the bottom. And they almost, to me, started to feel like play forms. Again, when I look at this work, even just now, I'm getting an image of this thing floating over these objects that are maybe shadows. So every time I look at them, they tend to provoke different images. And I feel in art that's a really important notion, because, and I have this big problem, I have to name things, because I want my work to have specificity, because every shadow comes from an object. But I also want it to have a lot of ambiguity. So I want to be able to, the reader to be able to, the person in the show to be able to see many things. So that was the colograph. It's funny, when I started my residency at EPI, I was in love with silkscreens. So I did lots of silkscreens because they're much less tedious than printmaking in a traditional way, like etchings and things. And they involve color. And color has always been a little bit of a problem with me, but I continue to experiment with the colographs and now with the silkscreens. And then with the silkscreens, I took some of my images. This image comes from one of the images from McDowell that was 3 foot by 6 foot, called The Colonist. And I then massaged it on Photoshop to make a multiple. And I have a whole series of these, some of them not perspectival, some of them not. But sometimes with silkscreens, and I feel with my work in general, and like I was saying with the airbrushes, sometimes the thing just is right, and you see it's right, and you keep yearning for some other pieces to be what it could be, but in this piece, I was satisfied. And actually, the original silkscreen is on white paper, and at the very end of the run, I just threw some gray paper in, and I really love the gray paper. So I only have a few of the pieces on gray, and I have a lot on the white. But I really enjoyed it. That was great. This one was a piece that I worked with Jace Clark, who was the master printer at EPI, and he and I I must say this was kind of a collaboration where you might say 1 + 1 = 3. Because we would talk with each other, he would be teaching me techniques, I would be looking at the work, we would go to his studio, look at his work, he had an airbrush, I wanted to get an airbrush. So we really, for me, when I work even with my students, it's more of a dialogue, that is the art intervention, rather than me sitting in a room and waiting for this bolt of lightning to give me a great idea. So I did this plate, and this is a plate which is a section of a much larger drawing that's in my catalog from the last show. And I initially just did this slice, and I set it up where, like I said in the other ones, I just did some initially line pieces. And then I did some aquatint. Aquatint basically means that you paint out an area, and you allow dust, or in this case, spray paint, to hit the plate, and where that spray paint hits, the paint is darker, and where the plate is smooth, the ink is lighter. And again, another mistake. While I was spraying, a big glob of paint came out. I was pissed off initially. Jace, and this young guy is telling me to relax, things I tell my students. And when I eventually printed it, it was great because clearly there was a night and a day. And then I wanted to kind of play with this idea of mixed media, so I took some bookboard and cut deep impressions in the bookboard from my drawing. And then we cut this slot out and printed this all at once. So the plate is inked and put into the chipboard or bookboard mat, and you run it through and you get the embossing. And it's quite nice. I'm really pleased with it. I tried many things. I tried silk screening over this, and that just killed it. And again, the amazing thing about this work, in particular for me, is when it got matted and framed, it had a completely different presence than when I was working on it. So they do become a little more precious, I guess, when they're framed, because your eye goes in, and just a certain amount of, when I come into the gallery and look at this drawing, it's much more powerful or print than I ever thought it would be. Again, this is a series from a drawing I had at Lehigh called Solar Constructs, I think it was called. And I noticed at that show, and I've noticed at several of my shows, that people really like when there's a clear geometry to look at, even if the drawing is complex and seemingly chaotic. If there's a geometry there, it seems to calm them down. So I made several plates of this, and like I was showing you before, the etching plate is much thinner in terms of the line is cut in very lightly, and then I did what I did on the other plate. I painted it out and put it in the acid for like 25 or 30 hours. And it ends up giving that relief so that when I inked it, it pooled. And I really like this pooling technique. And there's a funny aside, because halfway through my residency, I was starting to get really frustrated with the printmaking because it seems so tedious and you have to pre-plan everything and it can't be messy. And then I went to MoMA to see a Gauguin show of his prints, and he was a messy, sloppy, fun-loving printer. And so I came back from that show and kind of relieved and said, okay, now I'm going to play. So even though at times Jace would say, well, you can only run a print through once, on this one I ran it through twice. And I really liked what happened because actually the first time I ran it, the ink was really deep because I put a lot on it. This is the second time, and then this is the third time. So every time I did it, I found new things out. And this, initially, and this is another, I don't know if I would call it a problem, but it's a conundrum, you might say, that artists fall into, is this notion of naming or having images or words come to you when you're making something abstract. This started to look like the moon to me, especially the fact that it came from Solar Constructs. And I started to think, well, maybe I can do a Phases of the Moon piece. But every time I tried to do that in a very deterministic way, it never worked. So I gave that up for a couple of months. Then toward the end of, right before the show, I ran these again, and I accidentally printed, not actually, I happened to print 2 on one page because I wanted to save paper because there was a proof. So I said, well, I really like that. And so I ended up doing these 3, and now I call it ecliptic convergence because it's kind of like an eclipse, but it's really what it is. But I'm very pleased with the 3 of them. They seem to work in a nice way. This piece, again, is an etching, and one of my early etchings from a very large drawing that I actually placed in a show at the Allentown Museum several years ago. That Michiko, who was the curator here, was actually on the panel, so it was kind of interesting, full circle. But when I did the lines, I really enjoyed it as an etching, and it almost felt very light and effervescent. And then when I ended up aqua tinting it, it felt very heavy and gravitational. So this one's called Light Lines. This one's called Gravity, because I really felt like things were sinking to the bottom of the hole. And it's kind of an interesting process of printmaking in aqua tint, because when you aqua tint, it gets really dark and black, and it kind of freaks you out because this is so light and beautiful, and this was all fairly dark. And so you have to actually burnish the metal to take the texture off to make it smooth again. And you know, I always tell my students about this notion of why drawing is so important is because it has a tactile, sensual reaction rather than a mouse and a keyboard. And this was really true, because here you have to first scratch the metal and then cover it and then actually smooth it out again. So the process was very interesting to me. And eventually, you know, after a whole year of being a printmaker, I've actually fallen in love with printmaking. I still think I consider myself. Okay, this piece, again, following the drawings the prints I was just showing you, is more delicate than my other drawings. And I noticed when I did the line print of it, it had a certain effervescence, almost calligraphic look to it. And so these are two aqua prints. And I thought on this one with the shadow box, I wanted to include the plate because I think it's important for you to see. But I'd like to end the conversation with these two pieces because they really are endemic to my whole idea about light and shadow. They come from the embossings. And then one day in my studio, the sun comes in around 3:30 really well. I happened to just be holding the drawing up, and I noticed the way the light came through, so I started to slice the embossings. And when you slice the embossings, the light then comes through, and it becomes like a filter in a way. So, and I tried it with colored lights and everything else. But it's really, for me, it actually takes the 2D into the 3D, and it starts to talk about the notion of light and filter or even aperture. And this is the one that was the piece that I used for the invitation. And I'm definitely going to do more of these. I remember when I taught in the, was it in the late 80s at Atlanta College of Art, I was playing around with this stuff. So it's kind of interesting how it resurfaced. But it's really kind of interesting because not only do you get the light, you get the shadow of this on the light. So it has all the pieces together. And it seemed to be a great way to wrap up the show. Thank you.